lecture series on rethinking identity among Indigenous people. So I welcome all of you to this public lecture. And before I invite the chair and the speaker and others, I would like to say something about BKI public lecture and why we do this lecture. BKI, as you might know, stands for Bethesda Khankho Institute. This is a Center for Integrated Studies, specialized in Indigenous studies. We have different activities. One is the postgraduate diploma in Indigenous studies, in collaboration with Martin Luther Christian University. And the second one is a public lecture. And the main reason for this public lecture is to serve the wider society. We have had BKI public lecture last year. One was on rethinking Christianity among Indigenous people. We have a speaker from the Maori Indigenous scholar from New Zealand. The second speaker was from Ghana, Africa, a historian speaking on the Indigenous history and theology. And similar to that, we have the first lecture in this series, Rethinking Identity Among Indigenous People. As we all know, faith, identity, culture, land are so important for Indigenous people. But at the same time, the right understanding is crucial for us, for our survival, and also for the coexistence among Indigenous people. First lecture of BKI public lecture in this series will look at identity and how we understand identity and the scientific reality of this phenomena, and how at the end we could possibly take it to live out that understanding in a society where there's conflict is very common, places like Northeast. So today's lecture is the core, if you like to use that word, of Indigenous people's existence. Therefore, I invite all of you to this lecture to participate in a way that is contributing to each other and also to the institute. We have Dr. Ruth Nyondelhin, who is the chair. And before I invite her to chair the session, maybe a word about her. Dr. Ruth Nyondelhin has finished his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, Delhi. And currently she's doing a postdoctoral studies with ICSSR, doing a research in that Center for Medicine and Community Health. Again, very important study or research for Indigenous people. A lot to say about her, but to save time, let me say that word that much. Now I invite Dr. Ruth. She herself is a sociologist. So appropriate that we have her chairing this session, and she will introduce both the speaker and the respondent.
Thank you, Dr. Lamboy, for the kind introduction. I feel humbled and privileged to chair this lecture. So thank you, BKI, for the opportunity. Well, we have been excitingly looking forward to this public lecture to be delivered to us by a notable sociologist, Professor Andrew Smith, We look forward to his talk on a topic which is rather timely and pertinent in the current times. So as the chair, I would like to welcome you all once again. But before I introduce and give the time to our speaker, just a quick note. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box. I'll bring them up during the Q&A session after the lecture. And also to maintain the quality of the sound during the lecture, let's all be cautious of the mute button as well. With that, we shall now turn the time over to our speaker for today. Good morning, Professor Smith. It's a good afternoon here in India. We are delighted to have you with us today. Professor Smith has a long list of work and achievements over the years, so it will rather cost us much of our time if we go through his lengthy CV. So what I will do is I will just briefly highlight few from the list, just to give us an idea of the kind of work he had been engaged with over the years. Professor Smith has a long list of work, as I said, so I'll briefly highlight from the list. Professor Smith, Professor of Sociology, belongs to the School of Social and Political Sciences, University of Glasgow, Scotland. His main area of interest lies in the study of literature, sport, and creative cultures in the colonial and post-colonial context. His doctoral research involves empirical work with the Nigerian expatriate community in the west of Scotland and an investigation of the experiences of authors and artists working in Nigeria. He has more than 35 publications, including books and articles. To mention a few, his book titled Racism and Everyday Life, Social Theory, History and Race, and another book titled CLR, James, and the Study of Culture are widely read books by scholars, especially those working in the field of racism. In fact, CLR James and the Study of Culture was shortlisted for the British Sociological Association Philip Abrahams Prize for 2011. And another essay which discusses and compares James' writing on the culture and Black politics was the winner of the British Sociological Association Sage Prize for Innovation Excellence 2012. More recently, he has worked on the relationship between racism and everyday life, and this work relates to his current role as a co-investigator with the Economic and Social Research Council on the dynamics of ethnicity. In particular, he has tried to bring together sociological work on racism and ethnicity with the philosophical discussion of everyday life. Professor Smith has supervised nearly 20 PhD students to completion in the areas of cultural sociology, the sociology of racism and anti-racism, the sociology of everyday life, Black radical social theory, etc. So today, he will be speaking to us on the topic, what is social identity, reflections on the possibilities and pitfalls of the politics of identity. Professor Smith, you have about 40 minutes to speak, so over to you, sir, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ruth. I'm humbled by your very kind and fulsome introduction. And one of the small positives to have come out of the awful year and a half that the world has been through is the fact that we are better at using these kinds of technologies, I think, and that it gives us the opportunity to meet colleagues and people who are interested in similar questions around the world much more easily than might otherwise have been the case. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity and for the warm welcome that you've extended. I want to offer also my heartfelt thanks to Lamboy for the invitation to give the talk. A few years ago, when Lamboy was undertaking his PhD at Glasgow, I was very privileged to have the chance to meet with him on a few occasions, and we talked about the question of identity in that context. And I've always been very grateful, and I learned a great deal from those discussions. So I'm glad of the opportunity to revisit some of those questions today. So thank you, Lamboy. So let me just share a PowerPoint presentation with you if I can. Does this appear for everybody? Is that visible for everyone?
Yes, yes.
Yes, 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 sir.
It's visible.
Okay, I'll get going. Let me say at the outset that I'm not here to tell anybody how to think about identity, and it's certainly not my place to tell people who are working with and for Indigenous communities how they might best approach these issues. And I have to say that as I have been preparing the talk, I've increasingly come to feel that the question that I initially proposed to Lamboy for the talk today, the title that I proposed, "What is Identity?" was a terrible title, and a kind of badly misguided one, in a sense. Misguided because it implies that identity is a thing, right? That it's a kind of fixed phenomenon that we can somehow just define or pin down, conceptually speaking. So with apologies to you for amending my original title, I think perhaps a more useful question to ask might be, how are we invited to understand identity? How are we invited to understand identity? What stories about identity, what ways of conceiving of our identities are present to us in the world, and what political and ethical implications come with those potential different ways of understanding identity? And I do believe it's really worth us reflecting on those questions, because, as I want to try and argue in the talk, assumptions about what identity is and how it works are very deeply implicated in, they both reinforce and they reflect particular kinds of political and social arrangements. And for that reason, it seems to me we empower ourselves if we try to bring those stories about identity to the surface, if we try and make them explicit, and just be attentive to what they are telling us about who we are and how the world works around us. So in a very modest sense, that's what I'd like to try to contribute to here. But of course, ultimately, this is a project that has to take place through dialogue. So in that sense, I'm also very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts about these questions in due course and your reflections on them on the basis of the different places and contexts in which all of you work. So much of the research that I've done, as Dr. Ruth kindly explained in her introduction, has been focused on writers from what we might call the Black radical tradition. In other words, writers who are of African origin, but wherever they lived in the world, were concerned to understand and to try to find ways to fight back against the different forms of violence that accompanied European colonialism. So perhaps I can start with one writer from the Black radical tradition, whose story I want to consider, because I think perhaps it helps us bring out a central confrontation over how identities can be understood. So this is, as many of you may know, Oludoro Ekuano, as he's generally known today. So Ekuano was born, by his own account, in the southeastern part of what is now Nigeria, sometime in the middle part of the 18th century. And as a child, he's captured by slave traders. He's carried from his homeland to the coast, where he is confined with many others in the hold of a slave ship before being taken across the Atlantic to be sold in the slave markets of Virginia. Unlike the vast majority of other enslaved men and women, Ekuano was eventually able to save enough money to purchase himself back from his owner, to buy himself from his owner. And he eventually settles in England, where he becomes amongst other things, a crucial figure in a prominent public voice in the 18th century campaign to abolish slavery. And the reason why we know as much about him as we do is that in 1789, he publishes by subscription his autobiography, the full title of which you can see here on the right-hand side, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oludoro Ekuano or Gustavus Vassa the African, written by himself. Oludoro Ekuano, the African. That title is significant because it's precisely that claim. It's that statement of self-identity which made Ekuano's life story such a powerful contribution to the abolitionist cause. This was a context in which powerful economic and political groups in Britain and in the Caribbean were consistently trying to justify slavery, either by presenting it as a relatively benign process or by presenting Africans themselves as basically passive or without voice. So in that context, Ekuano's interesting narrative is a powerful double act of resistance. On the one hand, it forces British readers to come face to face with the violent reality of enslavement, what it meant in people's lives. And on the other hand, by doing that, of course, it is also in itself a demonstration of, it's an enactment of the fact that the enslaved had agency of their own, that they were able to reflect on and describe and act in response to their own experiences. So it's precisely the fact that Ekuano speaks as Ekuano the African that most threatened the attempts made by the defenders of slavery to present slavery as morally defensible. And you can get a sense of just how troublesome those lobbies found Ekuano's voice by the fact that during his lifetime they invested considerable amounts of time and effort in trying to discredit him, in trying to argue that his account was inauthentic, that he was not who he claimed to be. The version of the interesting narrative that's held at my university's library in Glasgow, which is a later edition of the book, has a preface added by Ekuano in which he specifically seeks to repudiate the claim that has been made in various London newspapers by slave owners that he's not really African, that he has no authentic right to speak in the name of that identity. So, what's the purpose of this example? Well, what might we take from it in trying to understand the stories of identity? Well, I want to suggest that we can see in Ekuano's account and in his life more generally two different ways of conceiving of identity coming into confrontation with each other. On the one hand, there is a conception of identity as something that the individual bears within themselves, some essential quality, something that we have lodged in the interiors of our minds or our bodies, which defines who we are from the inside. It's that conception of identity, of course, which is being articulated in the slave owner's challenge to Ekuano. Are you or are you not really the bearer of the identity that you claim? And of course, Ekuano is shrewd enough to know that in order for his voice to be heard in the public sphere in 18th century England, he has to accommodate himself to that politics of identity. He has to know how to present himself as the bearer of that identity, as something inherent in him, in order to be taken seriously, for his account to have the political force that it comes to have. It has to be the story of Ekuano, the African, written by himself. And yet, on the other hand, what the story that Ekuano actually tells us, reveals, is a very different experience of identity, or a very different understanding of identity, because by his own account, he is not born thinking of himself as Ekuano, the African, at all. After he is first kidnapped as a child, he's taken through a series of different local communities. He calls them nations, and he finds himself then amongst a whole series of different peoples whose beliefs and cultural practices and languages are more or less completely foreign to him. And he has no sense of a shared identity with the people whose lives he passes through on that journey. That sense of a shared African identity only begins to emerge for Ekuano when, in his own words, he first arrives in the slave ship. When, as he says, I looked round the ship and I saw a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, so that I no longer doubted of my fate. Were we to be eaten by those white men with their horrible looks, red faces and loose hair? I couldn't help expressing my fears and apprehensions to some of my countrymen. I asked them if these people had no country, but whether they lived in this hollow place. So, as the African-American scholar Alexander Bird has pointed out, it's there. It's in that hollow place, in the face of the violence orchestrated by these white men with horrible looks, in the context of being chained together with a multitude of black people of every description. It's there that Ekuano first refers to those other people as my countrymen. It's there that he first begins to understand himself as sharing an identity with them. So, in other words, what Ekuano's narrative of his life reveals is a very different formation of identity, not identity as some inherent quality to be found inside of the individual, which defines who they are from the inside out, as it were, but rather identity as something that is accomplished or constructed or produced in and through relationships with others. So what I'm suggesting is that Ekuano's story helps us grasp the fact that there are, as it were, two radically opposed paradigms, two radically opposed ways of understanding identity, which I'll just try and summarize briefly here. A kind of first view, which tends to conceive of identity as something pre-given, as something fixed within the self. And a second view, which tends to see it as something emergent. In other words, something which attains its significance in and through the living social relationships of which we are a part. Something which emerges open-endedly through those relationships. A first view which treats identity, as it were, as a kind of measurable, empirical fact about an individual in themselves, something that we have in ourselves, and a second view, by contrast, which thinks of it as something that we do in and with others, something that's born in practice with others. And thinking about identity in the first way, I think, tends to lead us to naturalize it. It encourages us to think about it as a kind of a consequence of the body or of who we are born. Thinking about it in the second way reminds us that identities are always historical phenomena. So identities are things which are claimed and ascribed and attributed. They're put to work always in specific social and political situations. And often, of course, as was the case for Ekuano, that process is one which has taken place in the context of and in direct response to and in resistance to experiences of oppression. So my suggestion is that we can see a confrontation between these two different ways of understanding identity playing out across the modern world, and particularly in the context of European imperialism and its aftermaths. European societies, as they came to be organized around bourgeois liberal institutions and around capitalist economies, have to a significant extent been premised on, and they've reproduced the assumption that identity is an inherent self-contained quality of the individual. The story of how that conception comes to exist historically is obviously a very long and complicated one, and I can't go into it in detail, but you can see how it is expressed in a whole range of powerful institutional practices in things like the collection of census data, for example, by which states enumerate and count their citizenries, or in the processes of the law, for example, with their operating assumption that the individual is the bearer of specific rights. And I think it's probably true to say, at the risk of being a little controversial perhaps for this in the current audience, that in some ways I think that idea of identity as an inherent inward quality has also been one that's been nourished by the traditions of Protestant Christianity, which tended to shift the question of spiritual identity into the interior of the individual, as to require the believer, in Max Weber's words, to be continually feeling their own pulse, spiritually speaking. But above all, I want to argue, I think that way of conceiving of identity, that first dominant paradigm of identity that I've tried to describe, has been nourished by two powerful sets of social institutions. Firstly, it's a view of identity that is implicit in many of the ways in which modern scientific traditions have tended to approach or to understand or research human existence. As you will know, there is a long history of European scientific efforts to try to locate some key to individual identity, some factor which determines who the individual is and what their essential characteristics will be, somewhere in the hidden recesses of the body. That search had its most dehumanizing and awful expression, of course, in the traditions of so-called race science in the 19th century, which, you know, as you can see from this illustration from a book from that period, which assumed that the fundamental identity of the person could be found in some physiological feature, the size of their cranial cavity, or the color of the skin, or whatever it happens to be. And while that kind of race science has been widely discredited, the basic story about identity upon which it relies, the assumption that identity is an interior fact something settled which we bear within ourselves continues to shape responses to all kinds of much more recent scientific developments, as in, you know, the ongoing claims that there is some genetic factor that determines whether someone will or will not be a criminal when they grow up, or conversely, the neuroscientific searches for something in the makeup of the brain that explains why some people supposedly are more creative than others. And another expression of this idea that we've seen certainly recently in West European and North American societies, but I imagine that they are evident around the world, is the rise of commercial genetic ancestry testing. So tests generally run by private companies which promise to reveal on the basis of a DNA test whether an individual is actually a Viking or whether they are the descendant of some medieval Irish king, or whether they can claim, as the American Senator Elizabeth Warren claimed recently, that they have a Native American identity. For those of you who don't know, Elizabeth Warren, the Democratic Senator in 2018, partly in response to continued attacks on her by Donald Trump, released the results of a genetic test which had been carried out by an academic at Princeton University in order to justify her previous claim that she had indigenous ancestry. And at the time, Kim Tallbear, who is an indigenous scholar in the US, wrote, "Whether she has Native American ancestry in her family tree, we don't know. And in a sense, it doesn't matter anyway, because that's not the way that the Cherokee Nation defines who is Cherokee." Warren had claimed to have Cherokee ancestry. It's not the way that indigenous people ourselves define who gets to be indigenous or who gets to be Native American, because Tallbear went on to insist indigenous identity in the understanding of those communities is not defined by whether you do or do not have some particular marker in your genetic code. Rather, it's the expression of living, historically situated social relationships. It's not a matter of what one has in oneself. It's a matter of what one has with others. It's not a matter of what one has in oneself. It's a matter of what one has with others. And the key point, Tallbear said, is that Elizabeth Warren has no living relationships with indigenous communities or indigenous peoples in America. So here it is again. This is the same confrontation between two different ways of understanding what identity is. Warren's claim to be Cherokee demonstrates, of course, precisely the power of this dominant conception of identity as something that one has, a fixed indwelling quality of the self. And it shows how far that kind of understanding continues to be reinforced by the way in which scientific technologies get received and understood, the stories that they are used to tell about us and our lives. Of course, it makes something else clear as well. It demonstrates the damaging kind of political work which that understanding of identity can sustain. As Tallbear argued extensively at the time, one of the consequences of claims like Warren's and similar claims made by many other white Americans is that they effectively deny to indigenous communities the right to determine the scope and the boundaries of their own self-identities. By making identity something that an individual can claim to own purely on the basis of themselves and their own bodies, what's inside of themselves, those claims deny, Tallbear argued, the reality of an identity, which is in fact the product of living, ongoing social relationships within a community. And of course, in doing that, those claims replicate and they reinforce the basic denial of Indigenous voices and Indigenous agency, which has been the fundamental premise of white settler power in America. So science is one key context in which this dominant paradigm of identity has been reinforced. The other context, it seems to me, is our economic system and the way in which that system teaches us to think about ourselves. And I'll risk going back to a much older kind of classical reference here, but here's Karl Marx, who in one of his earlier writings says something which to my mind is powerfully provocative. He says, private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is only ours when we have it, when it exists for us as capital, or when it's directly possessed, eaten, drunk, or worn, or inhabited by us. So what Marx is saying, it seems to me, is that life lived under the conditions of a capitalist economy doesn't just have practical consequences, it also it tends to inculcate, it tends to sustain a particular way of understanding and making sense of the world. And a key feature of that capitalist epistemology, that way of understanding the world that capitalism nourishes, is that natural and social phenomena tend to be assumed to have value or meaning only insofar as they belong to us, only insofar as we are able to take possession of them. All of the possible joy that we might find in the things and the people that we encounter in the world, Marx goes on to say, all of our sensual engagement with the world is diminished because it comes to be overshadowed by the constant question, are these things ours? How can we possess them? Marx writes, our physical and mental senses are ever more estranged by the dominance of this sense of having, And that, it seems to me, is equally and absolutely true of the way in which we are expected to understand our identities. Because the key feature of that dominant conception of identity, which I've been trying to describe, is precisely that it reduces identity to something that we have, that it treats it as being fundamentally like a kind of possession. That, after all, is exactly what is expressed in the idea that you can claim to own a particular identity simply by paying for a genetic test, which gives you a piece of paper which allows you to make that claim. And, you know, needless to say, that way of thinking about ourselves and our identities fits more generally with the way in which we are taught to imagine ourselves as actors within a capitalist landscape, as basically self-interested, self-contained individuals, stripped of social relationships, and our success and our failure defined only by what we bring in and of ourselves to the endless competition of the marketplace. So, in summary, what I'm arguing is that much of the social and economic arrangement which has come to be taken for granted in the so-called West, and which to a significant extent, but in differing ways, has been globalized through the histories of colonialism and post-colonialism, has involved a radical denial of human relatedness, a denial of the interdependence which connects us to each other. And that denial extends necessarily also to the dominant way in which we are asked or expected to understand our identity, which comes to be seen not as something that we create with and for others, but as something that is like a possession that we keep safe within the walls of our individual persons. Now, the alternative to that denial of relatedness, it seems to me, is not simply the assertion of a collective identity of one sort or another. I say that even though, of course, it is true that collective identities, whether they're defined religiously or culturally or linguistically or in many other ways, those kinds of identities have often been absolutely crucial to, and they remain crucial to, the efforts by which communities around the world have organized themselves to fight against oppression. But it's perfectly possible to claim a collective identity, as we've seen with the example of Elizabeth Warren, in a way that still treats it as being something that is owned by the individual. Every year at my university, I supervise undergraduate and postgraduate students who want to research social identity in some way, and often the identities that they're interested in researching are some kind of collective identity, whether it's defined by sexuality or ethnicity or whatever it might be. But equally often, the questions that they want to ask about that identity: how does this person perform their identity? How does this set of people describe their identity? How do this group of people express their identity? Make clear the persistence of the assumption that identity is something that one has, that it's an inner possession which kind of expresses itself out from the inside of people, even if it's a possession which other people also have, rather as if it was a particular brand of product which different people all owned together. And I don't say that with any intention of belittling my students, many of whom go on to do really eye-opening, innovative work. I just say it to make clear that claims about collective identities, it seems to me at least, can be perfectly well accommodated to, they can fit within this dominant understanding of what identity is and how it works. Perhaps I can offer one final example just to very briefly explore this further. A former doctoral student of mine, Panos Theodoropoulos, has spent months conducting a covert investigation within life within one of the 21st century's other hollow places, that is to say, within one of the huge Amazon warehouses in the UK, where commodities are stored in their millions to be picked and packed for delivery. And there have already been many reports from within these warehouses which reveal just how physically and mentally damaging the working conditions there can be. But what Panos's research revealed was something more insidious, because what he encountered in the warehouse where he was working, was the deliberate promotion by the management there of a kind of culture in the warehouse, which on the one hand encouraged a very diverse workforce, mostly made up of migrant workers, many of them from the global south, encouraged those workers to take pride in their own national and ethnic identities, at the same time as trying to carefully develop and build a collective identity that cohered around loyalty to Amazon, the company, and a shared commitment to quote unquote customer satisfaction. And that collective identity, he reports, was constantly being reinforced in a whole series of everyday practices in the warehouse. Managers sharing inspirational quotes about working together, or occasional parties or kind of rewards to encourage or celebrate hard work. And most particularly, in the periodic awarding of a coveted blue badge to the person who was deemed to be the associate of the month for that particular month. And the blue badge was a sign that the person in question has been granted a formal contract with Amazon, which is important because having a contract with Amazon as a company grants the person who has that contract a whole series of extra privileges and securities, which most of the rest of the workforce in the warehouse don't have, because they are largely employed through contract labor agencies of one kind or another. So the example shows that capitalist organizations are absolutely happy to speak the language of collective identity, and they're happy to do so because, in this case at least, it casts a kind of humanizing veneer over what was in fact a situation of stark interpersonal competition. Amazon, Panos writes, Amazon succeeds in getting the workers to exert themselves, to compete with each other, while at the same time maintaining a facade of collective spirit and diversity, which it uses to defend itself against the threat of unions or other worker-led organizing efforts. So I use this final example to suggest, at least that it seems to me, that the issue is not simply whether we're talking about individual identities or collective identities. I think the question rather is about the defense or the denial of relatedness, human relatedness, as central to our understandings of ourselves. Or to put it another way, we can ask of our conceptions of identity a kind of ethical question, right? Do those understandings orient us? Do they point us towards ourselves or towards others? Do they ask us to be concerned primarily with who we are in and of ourselves, or do they ask us to recognize that our lives have meaning only in and through the tapestry of human relatedness in which we live? So I've spent much of this talk focusing on the consequences of what I've argued is a dominant conception of identity characteristic of modern capitalist society. But as Ekuano's story of the claiming of an African identity suggests, as Kim Tallbear's defense of indigenous traditions of sociality in the US suggests, the history of that dominant conception of identity is always also the history of resistance to it. It's the history very often of subaltern or marginalized communities of one kind or another who continue to assert and defend an understanding of identity, not as a private possession, but as something that is premised on practices of reciprocity and shared obligation and responsibility. Panos, in his research, also found that process of resistance underway. He found it underway in the extent to which migrant workers in the Amazon warehouse, in the face of that deeply competitive atmosphere, found all kinds of small surreptitious ways to support and care for each other in the gaps that the surveillance of the system allowed them. And he found it also in the emergence outside of the warehouse of much more formalized groups organized by migrant workers for themselves, which were aimed at establishing new economies of solidarity and new forms of mutual support, both in the workplace and beyond. Those groups are mobilizing in the name of a politicized self-identity. They are groups of migrant workers, of course, but the understanding or the articulation of identity that they offer is not one of identity as a personal attribute, but rather identity as a consequence and an expression of living practices of human relatedness and interdependence. So this is my last point. I mean, nobody working with or aware of the work of the Bethesda Khankho Institute needs me to say this, of course, but it seems to me that that conception, that practice, those practices in support of human relatedness are precisely where resistance to that dominant understanding of identity are most powerfully being expressed and articulated in our world. Some time ago, Marx, to quote him again, in his rather technical language, articulated the kind of underlying principle which is expressed in and through these practices. He says the human being is, in the most literal sense, an animal which can individuate itself only in the midst of society. By saying that, Marx is only saying what has been the common knowledge and common practice of many communities around the world in the face of the powerful social and economic forces that I've tried to describe in this talk. For example, something very much like the same principle is expressed in the Bantu concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu meaning, as it's been articulated by many African writers and scholars, Ubuntu being the idea of being self through others, or more fully the idea that a person is a person only because of other people. And that principle of relatedness comes with an ethical obligation in tow, because it points us towards the reciprocities and the obligations that we share with others. And more than that, it asks us to understand that our selfhood, our self-identities are not some kind of autonomous achievement. They're not something that springs from within us. They're not a project that we pursue through the course of our lives according to our own lights, as it were. They're something for which we are always indebted to others. We owe ourselves to others, right? We owe ourselves to others. That is true in both of the senses in which we might understand that sentence. On the one hand, our selfhood is always and only a consequence of our human relatedness. We only understand who we are by virtue of being in lives with other people. And then on the other hand, if that's true, if we owe our selfhood to others, then an ethical obligation follows from that recognition. The only way of redeeming that debt is to give ourselves equally back to others in return. So in that spirit, I close with the words of another great writer from the Black radical tradition, Frantz Fanon, who in the course of his evocative account of an encounter with European racism poses this urgent question. He says, was my freedom then not given in order to build the world of the you? And I'll stop there. Thanks.
That was indeed an insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for taking us through the very lucid examples that you have drawn from different life stories around how one conceives their identity. What really struck me was to rethink and reflect on how we conceive our identities by drawing out the principle of human relatedness. You have given us a perspective to rethink and shift that thinking of our selfhood and our self-identities, not as some autonomous achievement or as something that springs from within us, but understand that our selfhood is a consequence of our human relatedness, and also for that matter, our ethical obligation of giving ourselves equally to others in return. I think that was powerful. Thank you so much, Professor Smith. I will now invite Dr. Hoinailing Sitlau to give a response to the paper. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Hoinailing. She completed her PhD Sociology from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she is currently working as an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad. She is a recipient of the M.N. Srinivas Award 2016. She has published 2 books, Cookie Women, and another book, Deconstructing Colonial Ethnography, an analysis of missionary writings in Northeast India. She has also contributed chapters in edited books and articles in many reputed journals. Her research interests are religion, culture, ethnicity, and Northeast India. So over to you, Dr. Hoinailing.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you, Bethesda Khankho Institute, for inviting me to such an important lecture. I Googled on what a respondent is supposed to do, and it says I have to summarize, I have to point out important points, and I also have to try to relate to it. And I'm not sure if I'll be really able to do justice to the presentation today by Professor Andrew Smith, but I promise that I'll try my best. Thank you so much, Professor Andrew Smith, for the extremely engaging discourse on identity. And it is really thought-provoking and an interesting departure from the way we usually look at or study the concept of identity. Right? So from what I see, identity is a concept which is often simplified or taken for granted or used it in a variety of ways, right? And Professor Smith in the presentation have placed before us 2 radically opposed paradigms of identity. Right? One is in which he says that identity is not a fixed phenomenon and cannot be defined or pinned down and cannot be defined or pinned down conceptually. It is rather something that emerges through the living relationship of which we are a part. It is something that evolves and attains its significance through our relationship with others, right? So this is something that I feel it's something that resonates throughout the paper. And so the paper is about him making sense of some very important question. So it is important for us to revisit this question before we embark onto summarizing whatever is being presented today. So he began with this very crucial question: how are we invited to understand identity? What stories about identity, what ways of conceiving of our identities are present to us in the world? And what are the political and ethical implications of different ways of understanding identity? And our assumptions about identity often reflect and reinforce particular political and social arrangement. And in trying to make us better understand his point or his argument, he brought forth certain narratives, certain stories in different contexts, which really goes together with what he's trying to say today. So Professor Smith narrated a story of a person called Ekuano, who was sold in a slave ship. And initially he had no sense of anything in common with the other Africans in the ship. But this sense of shared identity emerged when he was placed alongside others. And this identity process was a gradual process. And based on this story, Professor Smith deduced that identity is not an inherent quality. It is not a pre-given or fixed within the self. It is rather accomplished or constructed and through relationship with others. And the second important point that I want us to to remember in his presentation is that he further said that the first view of identity, which he had discussed, has influenced the way in which modern scientific tradition have tended to approach or conceive of human being. And I feel that this is a very important trajectory of the paper, because for me, it connects the discourse on identity to the discourse on race. And this is evident in the tradition. This, he says, is evident in the tradition of race science in the 19th century, or the genetic ancestry testing on the basis of DNA tests. And we can relate to this because Indians, especially during colonial India, were no strangers to the practice of anthropometry, right? And if you read the writings of the work of Crispin Bates, who works in the University of Edinburgh, in the paper, there's caste and tribe, race, caste and tribe in central India, the early origins of Indian anthropometry. It's a study that is based on that, on anthropometric study of the society, right? And in order to substantiate his argument, Professor Smith brings in another relevant case of the case of American Senator Elizabeth Warren, who claimed a Native American identity in 2018 and released the result of a genetic test to support her claim to indigenous ancestry. And this has been refuted and challenged by Kim Talbert, an indigenous scholar, who says it is not genetic tests, but life realities that define indigenous identity, right? So he says that this idea behind a genetic test or race science or racism for that matter is backed up by the belief of a fixed and indwelling quality of the self. And this is sadly reinforced by the new scientific technology. And the third point that I want to highlight in his paper, which is equally important, is his experience, is his narration of his experience of supervising undergraduate students who works or research on social identity. And I can really relate to this because I also work on my PhD topic was on land and identity, a sociological study of the Khankho cookies of Manipur. And here I had tried to prove in my paper that land and identity are closely intertwined in the tribal realm. Therefore, any external force, be it the land laws under colonialism or the Indian nation state, would result in change in identity of the community concerned, right? And Professor Smith have cautioned us to a certain, or have reminded us to be cautious of a certain point on using the theories of identity here, because as a student of identity, we are often tempted to, or we find it easier to cut and paste or fit in our studies or findings or research to existing dominant theories that is based on a study. And sometimes, and in most cases, these studies are conducted elsewhere in a context that is entirely different from the one that we are studying, right? And it is a context that is different in terms of space and time, right? But because it is much easier to just apply these theories on our paper, we often subscribe to that strategy, right? And he says that that often the problem with much of the student who work under him is that their question is, how does this person describe their identity? How does this group of people articulate or perform their identity? And which is often clear that the assumption behind this question are that identity is something one has, a kind of inner possession, even it is a possession which others also have, rather than like being the owner of a particular brand or product. So Professor Smith says that the fault, or rather his apprehension, lies in the fact that they are all subscribing to the claims about collective identities, which can perfectly well accommodate or be accommodated to that dominant understanding, right? So it's easy to subscribe to something that's already there instead of finding something new or something that can be considered as a contribution to existing scholarship. And Professor Smith's presentation, I feel, is very clearly summarized in his quotation of the Bantu concept of Ubuntu, I am because you are, being self to others. It is based on the recognition that a person is a person because of other people. And he pointed out to us the ethical obligation that the notion entails, that selfhood, self-identification is not autonomous achievement or something that springs from us, but as something that we're indebted to others, we owe ourselves to others, right? But I can't help notice the similarity in two theories of symbolic interactionism, and I believe Professor Smith would be also well aware of these two theoreticians. One is Charles Horton Cooley, and the other is George Herbert Mead. Charles Horton Cooley developed his concept of looking glass self in his book, Human Nature and Social Order. And he says that self-consciousness and social consciousness are inseparable. And along the same line, George Herbert Mead also wrote in Mind, Self, Society that the self is something which has developed. It is not initially there at birth, but arise in the process of social experience and activity. That is, it is something that developed in a given individual as a result of his relationship to that relation to that process as a whole and other individual within that process. Right? So to him, the origin and foundation of the self are social. Right? Perhaps Professor Smith could tell us highlight to us the difference, the point of departure from these two theories to what he's arguing today. And I would also like this opportunity to bring it to you the possibility of a future study or research and introduce to you or narrate to you in a nutshell on the issues in the society today, in our society today, and from the time of colonialism to the issues today. And if it could encourage you to extend your research on identity in this context, right? So the coming of the Britishers in the 19th century made us aware of the idea of the existence of another world and people who were different from us, making us differentiate between us and them, right? That all of us, despite our difference, were all more alike as compared to them. We were encouraged to change our religion, and with its certain practice like ritual, dance, food habit, etc., that did not conform to the ideals of what constitute a normative Christian living to the Britishers. Then there were the changes in the land laws by colonial administrators, which restrict us from access to greater part of the forest, though it was a source of our livelihood. And this has been continued by the Indian state and followed by the Manipur state at present without any critical reflection on the origin and consequence of the law. And this notion of us and them or the other is not limited to the application or the binary opposition between the state and by state, I mean colonizers and Indian state and the native or the local. But also, it also brings about divides among locals themselves. So the translation of the Bible in the 1960s became a starting point for the emergence of dialectical identity and widening of the gap of ethnic divide among various settled tribes of Manipur who were categorized under the name or nomenclature of Kuki by colonizers allegedly for administrative convenience. And there were also have been the need felt for a nomenclature to present all the tribes together under a common name, maybe to give a political millage for the tribals to maintain a united front, and some propositions were Kukis, Chinkuki, Mizo, Chikim, Jo, Kochungte, etc. So we have different names and all of this in order to bring together or to maintain a united political front, right? So Professor Smith, putting this before you in a platter, of course, you had cautioned us in your presentation at the outset that you don't want to be considered as an authority on identity, but I would like to take this opportunity to encourage you to seriously think about this society and why BKI, to consider it as an avenue for your future research. I believe it would result in a more nuanced understanding of the concept of identity, which is already a very complex or complicated concept. Because I feel that an outsider's study would offer an interesting departure from the existing knowledge and also existing scholarship on identity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hoyneding, for substantiating the lecture through your in-depth response. I think that was really helpful as you contextualize the paper in the local scenario as well. So both Dr. Hoyneding and Professor Smith have highlighted important aspects for us to reflect and deliberate upon. So I will now invite Reverend Dr. Lamboy Haukip for a vote of thanks.
Well, friends, thank you so much for joining. So we have come to the end of the session. I would like to formally thank on behalf of BKI, Ruth, Dr. Ruth, who efficiently chaired the session. Thank you so much, Ruth, for your help today. Also to the respondent, Dr. Hoyneding, thank you so much for your beautiful response to the paper, and also sharing your thoughts to the TED discussion further. It was very helpful. Thank you so much. Our speaker, Professor Andrew, thank you so much for your, what the respondent rightly termed it, departure. The departure, the way we traditionally think about identity, and the way how naturally, scientifically, how identity functions as social constructs. Thank you so much for challenging us, stimulating our thoughts, and thank you very much for your paper. As I mentioned, identity is so important because that affects all of us, our life, our faith, everything of us. Therefore, it is so important that we had today this discussion. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Again, thank you so much, everybody, for taking a time to join us. May God bless all of you. Thank you.